All right, and our third speaker in our podium this morning is Lynda Brook. When I asked her what to share about this morning, she said, well, being from Liverpool, she very much appreciates the party going on last night, because apparently Liverpool FC is also an amazing football club, soccer, and there's a lot happening. Lynda is a pediatric palliative care physician and in the Children's Hospital in Liverpool, and really was asked to give a talk, which is ever so difficult, so I'm really looking forward to that, to talk about, like, I don't want you to inform my child, a clinical and cultural dilemma. Thank you so much, Lynda. Good morning.
So thank you for inviting me here today. I feel actually quite overwhelmed. I'm not sure I'm the right person to share this with you, but hopefully it will be useful. And hopefully I'll be able to challenge you with some thoughts. And actually a lot of exciting research evidence that supports what I've got to say today. So I don't want you to inform my child. I'm sure we've all been there. We've got a real challenge. Do we respect the parents' wishes, but do something that we feel is perhaps against the child's best interests and feels uncomfortable for us? Or do we talk to the child? Do we tell the child? Do we share with the child and risk damaging the therapeutic relationship with the parents? And of course, the answer is we need to find a way of getting a balance and doing both. So in this talk, I'm going to explore with you some of the ethical, cultural, and clinical aspects of that request, please don't tell my child, and hopefully provide a suggestion for a pragmatic and stepwise approach to dealing with this dilemma. But before I do, I want to bring up Father Christmas. So, why is it okay for us to lie to children about Father Christmas? A lot of us have done it, haven't we? And as a child, did you believe in Father Christmas? And how and when did you realize that he didn't really exist? How did that make you feel? So keep that thought in your mind, and we'll revisit that at the end. Not that it's Christmas, but it's a party, isn't it? So, why is it important to tell the truth? In simple terms, in ethical terms, you can think as a deontologist, a rule-based system, and ultimately, lying is just wrong. It's just wrong. You just shouldn't do it. But perhaps to make that a practical application, we need to think about, is lying exactly the same as maybe withholding information? There's degrees. Or if you're thinking from a consequentialist point of view or utilitarian point of view, actually, telling the truth is the right thing to do because it will have the best overall consequences. But we're in a dilemma here. It's not as easy as that. Oops. Hope it worked. So, can not telling the truth or withholding information ever be morally justified? There certainly seem to be some benefits. In the situation we're in, we would potentially maintain the relationship with the family. We would avoid difficult emotions. We would avoid frightening information. The child would not be burdened with worry. The child would not be burdened with decision-making or responsibility, or the responsibility of the consequences of their contribution to decision-making. We would be demonstrating support for the family, and overall, we would be showing that we were caring for the child. But ultimately, there would also be plenty of harm. The distances from the child and family would increase. And what we worry about is that by not telling the truth and not giving an explanation of what's happening, the child may become more frightened and aware, not knowing what is happening. There's always that risk of accidental disclosure. I can remember very clearly as a medical student, a child had been admitted to the ward, was having investigations for leukemia, but at that point the family hadn't been told. And a junior doctor went up to the child and the family and said, just going to do some blood tests to find out what sort of leukemia you've got. So it takes a lot of energy and effort to maintain a collusion, and there's always the risk that that might be broken with disastrous consequences. Those emotional challenges, the impact of that difficult information, can potentially be worse as the seriousness of the information gets bigger. And ultimately, if, and only if, but if, and it's likely to happen, the truth comes out, that's going to undermine the therapeutic relationship. So, is telling the truth always in the patient's best interests? There are certainly benefits. I'm going to change that because I'm struggling to read the slides down there. Okay. It helps to maintain choice, helps the patient to be involved in the therapeutic relationship, initiates trust and truthfulness. Importantly, it demonstrates fidelity, and this is the concept of putting the child first, demonstrating through actions and words that the child is the center of your concerns. It helps us to anticipate and helps the child to anticipate and plan for what is going to happen. It respects the child as an individual and also allows the development of autonomy, and we'll come on to that in a bit more in a minute. But it still potentially causes harm. Information can also come with fear, just like doubt or uncertainty. There's that concern about loss of hope, and again, we'll come on to that in a bit more in a minute. The burden of decision-making and its consequences, and you're seeing immediately, aren't you, that the reasons and the rationale, the harms are being replicated both in this slide and the previous slide. So a lot of these things are both potential benefits and or potential harms. We risk breaking the confidence of the parents and disastrously potentially have the child caught between a really difficult conflict between parents and professionals. And again, it can undermine the confidence in the therapeutic relationship. So, how do we share prognostic information with a child? We need to think about loss as part of a normal process in life. We all experience losses. We all experience change over our lives. It might be something very simple. It might be a loss of going to nursery and moving on to infant school. It might be loss of being an only child as your new brother and sister arrives. It can be very positive things, it's very negative things. And we know from Myra's work that children as young as 3 very much demonstrate through their behaviours and actions an awareness that they are moving towards end of life. And so we also know from another much more recent piece of work that children's behaviour and the decisions they make about telling the truth are influenced by whether they perceive that information will be helpful. So very young children are already demonstrating lots of ways of being part of that information sharing, part of the decision making. We know that living uncertainty is hard, but so is absolute certainty. If you knew exactly what day, what time, what second you were going to die, will you want to know that? I don't think I would. And also searching for explanations is part of human nature. And if there isn't a good explanation, we'll try and find one. We'll potentially make one up. So it's something that we need to acknowledge and work with. But we also need to think about the fact that a child is not the same as an independent adult. Children exist in the natural order of things as part of a family. And we really need to think about the support of the family as an integral part of the support of the child. We need to think of the family as an important part of learning for the child and making sense of the world, and that includes learning to make decisions. So, we've thought a bit about the ethics of it. We've thought about the fact that the child should be at the centre, but we need to think about the family. We also need to think about the truth. Is the truth an objective thing, or is it a subjective thing? It's probably got a number of different components, and the nature of the truth, the nature of the information may vary depending on the circumstances. And these changes and these perspectives vary across the child's illness journey. As clinicians, we might focus on biomedical facts and consider factual information, but actually, what might be much more important to the child and their family is what it means for them. So, are you a half-empty cup person, or are you a half-full cup person? And who do you see there? And who do you see now? So, it's not just the truth in terms of an objective fact, it's the interpretation of those facts, what it means for the person themselves, that is probably the most important thing, and the thing that we should be concentrating on. So, how has medical practice changed over time? How have attitudes changed over time to disclosing information, disclosing poor prognostic information in this instance? What we found is that over the late 60s to 70s and early 80s, in the Western health at least, there was a massive shift between non-disclosure of information, particularly diagnosis of cancer, to adult patients, from almost complete non-disclosure to almost complete disclosure. And the reasons for that were recognition that non-disclosure itself wasn't actually really helping. It wasn't serving the purpose for which it was being done. Most patients already had an awareness of the seriousness of their diagnosis, just like we've already heard that most children have an awareness of the seriousness of what's happening to them, but it may be an age-appropriate or context-specific awareness. What was found that patients imagined the worst in the absence of specific facts. And when denied opportunity to discuss those hopes and fears, those emotional distress got worse. And it denied them the opportunity to make plans and choices. And these principles should also apply to children. They're all certainly relevant to children. We've already heard some of that. So let's think a bit more about the cultural aspects of truth-telling and sharing prognostic information across the world. There are widespread cultural differences in attitude to truth-sharing, and what I'm sharing with you is just some of the research evidence. I think what is really, really important to emphasize is that this needs to be taken in the context of the individual child, family, and circumstances, and absolute generalizations are not going to help you in the everyday care, but awareness of some of the differences is really, really helpful. So there are different origins of non-disclosure. In Latin American cultures, it's more often mediated or influenced by the concern to avoid psychological harm by extinguishing hope, and we've already heard a lot about hope. And it's also mediated by concerns about physical harm causing death. But in Chinese cultures, it's much more about deference of wisdom to the family and the duty to maintain harmonious family relationships. So we might have a similar request, but for very different cultural reasons. Across different cultures, perspectives on childhood and adolescence change. The amount of time that a child is nursed, the amount of time that the child is seen as a child, age of consent, age of marriage or partnership will vary across different cultures and areas in the world. And the particular thing I wanted to mention was that continuity and bond between the child and their mother and the child, breaking that and moving to being an adult in their own way. And certainly what we've seen and recognised in the UK and I think in the Western world is what's been called the snowflake generation, a generation of young people who've lived quite sheltered and protected lives and perhaps almost thought to need to toughen up a bit compared with older people. That's probably changed a lot with COVID, but the point is that this is growing, changing, evolving over time, and generalizations aren't helpful. In Japan, though, and I wanted to bring this to your attention, there's a real reference and deference to the special bond between the child and the mother, and that continues and seen as being something that's core and central right into adulthood. Different perspectives on desirability of childhood behaviour are also seen. So in the US and in Western cultures, children are seen to be desirable if they're more verbally and physically assertive, whereas in Japan, physically and verbally restrained children are seen to be more desirable. There seem to be different and better behaviours. And there's also the perspective of different meanings of illness, depending on the family member affected, and also recognition that illness itself can carry stigma. We need to be aware of these things to help us interpret this request not to tell the child. Attitudes to disclosure across different cultures vary as well. So many cultures, particularly in terms of disclosing information to children, it's acceptable. There are real concerns, as I've mentioned already, that disclosure will damage help and in turn cause a poorer prognosis. And the emotional burden of that information is felt to be overwhelming, or there are worries that it will be harmful in terms of the child and may even expedite the child's death. We need to think, though, in terms of the child's learning and understanding in the context of growing up. And for many children, although the example here is a sort of cancer-based example, for a lot of children, having a life-limiting illness is actually a long thing. It's not something that happens, it's not a quick illness, it's something they grow up and develop with. And over that time, they're also going through other developmental processes. So a child diagnosed at around 5 years will have a different level of information need and understanding of their diagnosis than when they relapse in their early teens and when they perhaps have progressive disease later on. The worry is that over that time, if information isn't shared, if we don't keep it up in pace with the child's information needs and sharing with them what's happening to them, then we can have a collusion that grows and grows. Alternatively, though, if we continue to touch base and use each of those different points as cues for discussion, as cues for exploration, we can have a growth in terms of involvement, participation in decision-making. And that information sharing is a gradual thing that will happen over time in pace with the child's developmental needs. We know it doesn't need anything really, it doesn't need any research evidence, but it's clearly confirmed that giving emotional information is distressing. I'm not belittling the fact that good communication skills can help that information be portrayed sensitively and so that information can be understood and restrained. But somewhere in the middle of that, if it is bad news, and if the patient and their family don't appear to have had any recognition of that, probably we haven't done it quite right. What is important is the fact that the overall quality of life and the emotional distress of breaking bad news is there, but that distress can be increased if the recipient is unprepared, and that's where our communication skills come in, and that's where not putting off giving that difficult information so that it's a gradual information feed is more helpful. What about this real thing that families throw at us? What about the loss of poor prognostic, the loss of trust and hope through poor prognostic information? I certainly couldn't find any good evidence that poor prognostic information makes patients less hopeful. As we've heard already, it's probably more about reframing hope under new contexts, finding different and new things to hope for, hope developing and becoming different as the child's and family's journey continues. And in fact, prognostic disclosure may actually enhance parent trust in medical care. So it's not as straightforward as that. There's certainly very little evidence to suggest that hope itself is affected by poor prognostic information. And this again, more evidence really that extensive prognostic explanation to young adults with cancer can lead to more trusting relationships with healthcare professionals and mental calmness and hope. But it's really important to recognise that from this particular study, this was a study of young adults only 6 weeks from diagnosis, and that they had more optimistic recall than health professionals of the account of the dialogue. Let's think about this request for not giving information to the child from a professional perspective. Again, there are marked differences across different parts of the world in terms of professionals' perspective. So Western professional guidance advocates sharing intimate evidence with young people and encouraging participation. There's guidance from a number of professional organisations, including the International Society for Paediatric Oncology, and in the UK we have guidance from the GMC. But what that guidance also says is that the onus is on the clinician to determine the best interests, values, maturity, and desire to participate in decision-making. So as professionals, we have a real duty to assess and decide what information is given. And actually, certainly the GMC guidance says it's okay to withhold information if it would either cause serious harm, and admittedly that's more than just upsetting the child or making them more likely to refuse treatment. It's also possible and appropriate to withhold information if there is a request to do so and the child or young person makes an informed decision to defer to somebody else for decision making. What factors influence professional disclosure or confidence when they are disclosing? There are a number of different things. There's good evidence that the culture within a team or organisation or specialty will influence patterns of disclosure of information to patients and their families. The professional's own anxiety about death, their own fears of failure in terms of, or perceptions of failure in terms of the treatment they'd offered. If they identify with the young person and their family, and that emotional burden on themselves as information givers as well as the patient and family. It's also worth thinking about the language barrier, and the language barrier, if you have worked with interpreters, also can become a real empathy barrier. It's very difficult sometimes to communicate effectively and clearly, even in your own language. And when you're not doing that, and when there are cultural differences as well, it makes it really difficult to do. We know that many professionals avoid discussions on prognosis unless they're initiated by the patient or family, and as I said already, those feelings of professional failure. We also know that professionals' perspectives are affected by their cultural background. And so from a Western cultural background, the emphasis along the greater cost of non-disclosure, so the emphasis to disclose information. Professionals reported a stronger duty of care to the child versus to the child as part of a family unit. And professionals described that lingering sense of regret, feeling that they had offered inferior support and medical care. And I certainly can identify with that feeling of, oh, maybe we should have said a bit more, maybe we should have found a way to have those discussions that the family blocked. Those from a Western background struggled with a different way of thinking and giving and interpreting those cultural and non-verbal cues from other cultures, and felt a stronger sense of personal responsibility for giving information and facilitating dialogue. In contrast, in the same study, professionals from a non-Western background found it easier to understand requests for non-disclosure, presumably because they could identify with where that was coming from. They were more sensitive to non-direct communication style and being cautious in language, better able to understand and accommodate family-centered decision-making, and more influenced by work culture. And there was a greater emphasis, shall I say, on non-maleficence than, i.e. doing no harm by giving information that was potentially distressing or unwanted, and less emphasis on respect for the young person or child's own autonomy. Interestingly, in Japan, a real difference, this is a little bit of an old study now, but nevertheless, oncologists in Japan less likely to disclose cancer diagnosis to a child or adolescent. So only about 9.5% of Japanese professionals versus 65% of US oncologists. So quite a big difference, and that's just about disclosing a cancer diagnosis. It's not about disclosing progression and movement towards end of life. So what about the information needs and preferences of the children and young people? And that's what we really need to be getting to. A study of children and young people in Sweden found that children don't want to be excluded from bad news. They want to be informed, but they want to be informed as positively as possible and to maintain hope. That's that hope coming through yet again. They want to be informed at the same time as their parents. We need to think again about the cultural influence of and the cultural impact for young people who may be growing up as first generation from immigrant families. They're more likely to be integrated into their adopted culture, and they may also be much more familiar and much more fluent in their adopted language. And that may mean that they're actually serving as an interpreters at times. It may also mean that they pick up on cues, pick up on language, pick up on information that their parents may not. So they can be increasingly and additionally isolated and challenged. In terms of adolescents with cancer between 8 and 18 years of age at the beginning of treatment, this again is a study in the Western world, wanting trustworthy information, preferring to have the information from a person rather than the internet, and that's quite important. Wanting information to be adapted to their needs, again, this personalization of information. Increasingly wanting detail and depth with increasing age, wanting information but not information on prognosis. So this is cancer at the beginning of active treatment. Their information needs more practical than factual. So what does it mean for me? Different information needs, and depending on their communication style and family culture. So this is all melded together. Using information to preserve hope and put what was happening into the context of now. So at that point, this isn't forever. This is something I can get through. This is a difficult time in my life, but it's not going to be forever. But they're also relying very clearly on parents and significant others to help them process the information. And there's perspectives for the young people themselves, demonstrating awareness of end of life we're already aware of, but also young people, and well, younger children will use storytelling and pretend play to make sense of their world. So we need to bring that into this too. Children and young people who are able to discuss and understand what is happening to them are going to have better symptom management and reduced emotional distress. And the perspective of parents, parental requests for non-disclosure being seen in the Western world as needing to be culturally specific, but differences in requests made by different cultural beliefs. Parents struggling with their emotions, feeling so overwhelmed with their feelings that they can't think of anything else, feeling anger at professionals, reflecting on the feelings of powerlessness and lack of control that they're sensing, and the reluctance to discuss death, representing their own pain and inability to accept the certainty of what is happening to them. So, perspectives of young people on end-of-life and decision-making, really important, and I'm going to have to move on, unfortunately, but young people want to be involved in decision-making. They want to have information given to them in a way that works for them, but their preferences will range depending on where they're at in their journey. Okay. So, I don't want you to inform my child. We've heard that parental request and heard that there are a number of factors, both cultural and personal influence that. The ultimate desire for all of us, or the ultimate desire that is driving this, is to protect the child. But often it's founded by beliefs that information may harm the child, reduce hope, increase distress, and shorten life. There's evidence that emotional distress from diagnostic disclosure is short-lived, and overall levels of distress are similar in disclosure and non-disclosure groups. And children's desire for information, understanding, and involvement in decision-making develops over time with experience and practice. So how do we resolve this? We need to explore the consequences, the concerns, preferences, and needs of the individual making the request. We need to make it clear that our priority is doing what's best for the child, and in doing so, we're taking into account the needs of a child as an individual, but also the needs of the child as part of the family, and doing our best to maintain the family as an integral supportive unit. So that means providing information tailored to the needs and preferences of the child in a stepwise but culturally competent fashion, using truth but in an age-appropriate way. Supporting and empowering parents to respond and recognize cues in their child, cues about what the child is thinking and feeling, cues that the child has an awareness of what is happening to them, and respond in an appropriate way. We might need to support the child directly, but we must do that as part of the family unit. We can use uncertainty, those questions, the what if we've heard about before, the I'm worried if, to maintain a combination of hope and doubt that will help move forward understanding as the situation changes. And I think it's worth considering storytelling and theoretical situations to open up discussions in a less threatening and age-appropriate way, particularly when there are cultural challenges that make it difficult to have those direct conversations. And that brings us back to Father Christmas. This is an old man with a beard who's very different and very, this is a very different situation to discussing a life-threatening illness. But perhaps a more gradual realization of the truth, like a gradual realization that Father Christmas doesn't exist, isn't necessarily such a bad thing. Thank you.